It's quite significant that we are talking about Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo, as we all know, was born in 1872, and next year, that is 2022, he will be completing 150 years of his work. It's quite significant that we talk about Sri Aurobindo at this point in several levels because uh, his thinking and his system of philosophizing and his poetics and his aesthetics and his whole systematic concept, the concept of life and how it is to be lived and what it entails, is very significant in the present point, no doubt. I choose to talk about Sri Aurobindo, poetry, and the triple transformation. Now, triple, that concept of three, the idea of three, is very significant in Sri Aurobindo's life. His life itself, as many scholars have pointed out, falls into three separate categories, almost three separate segments. No doubt they are linked. There is a holistic frame, but at the same time there are this three-part, tripart division. He, his early phase, in England, his schooling, and his exposure to classics, his exposure to Greek writing and Latin, text which he uh, explored. That falls into one phase, his early learning part, and then his movement into Indian politics, idea of nationalism and his involvement in the politics of his times. That is the second phase, and the third phase, of course, till his passing in 1950, is in Pondicherry, when he moved from Chandranagar and moved into Pondicherry. That is his three. So there is always this three which is significant for him. And in his philosophical thinking also, he has this three-part division. That is, he talks about matter, he talks about life, and he talks about the mental transformation or the levels and states of being in the mind. So there is this matter, life, and mind, which is the triple states of existence, planes and parts of being, according to Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. So I am talking about poetry and the triple transformation in Sri Aurobindo. Much of what I am going to say uh, was actually thought of prior to the pandemic. Well, I had then conceived of this with the hope that the political, the social, the environmental, and the spiritual crisis that the globalizing forces of market economics had unleashed could be countered with a transformation of a kind of internal perspective, a call towards the deeper spiritual self. I held the hope that prophet of life divine that Sri Aurobindo was had perceived the spiritual at the heart of being, and his call needed heeding in troubled times. Poetry could be salve because he was a poet through and through. It could be the salve, it could be salvation, poetry could be a reclamation, and poetry could call our wayward selves to order and a future. I believe that such a hope and prayer still stands in these very difficult times that we are passing through, which the pandemic, the minute virus has engendered in our midst. And hence, what I had thought of earlier appears to be relevant to our times now. Now, I'll begin uh, with a quote, a small extract from Jalaluddin Rumi. Rumi, of course, is quite, to the taste of the younger people of the present. Lots of young people, they are so fond of him because he talks about life, love, and death. And that is very, very significant for the young people. Rumi's quote goes like this. It's a small extract. The whole of my life summed up in these words. I used to be raw, then I was cooked, now on fire. Now, when you talk about poetry, you feel that there is no relevance to poetry in the present because the contemporary times We are facing intolerance, terrorism, the consumer culture, market values. But at the same time, when Rumi, whom I have just quoted, was alive and writing about his inner transformation, as several insightful scholars have pointed out, the Islamic world was on the gruesome rampage elsewhere. And yet, one cannot casually dismiss him as having been neither apolitical nor insensitive to worldly issues, if one were to take the pains to read him between the lines. Perhaps the genuine poet across cultures is often condemned to bear witness to humanity's horrible deeds and remains singing in isolation, poetically on fire, as he says. Or perhaps apparently he could turn his back on what others hold as life and seek the profounder truths of being and becoming, an interior transformation. The situation in the world, and in India in particular, warrants lesser significance for the finer poetic sensibilities either. And as the idea of religion in its fundamentalist avatar ever weaves a kind of fabric of terror and violence rather than what basically all religions teach, tolerance and love. What then is the relevance of raking up the dreamboat of a poet mystic like Sri Aurobindo, who lived and wrote in the last century about life divine, divinizing of life, and about divinizing one's own life in its totality? In brief, what does the work of Sri Aurobindo entail? What does it mean to us in the present? Can it reach beyond the centuries and speak to us in the present like the poetry of Rumi, albeit in a different context? Will it appeal to the sensibility of a new generation, like, say, a Paulo Coelho or a Justine Garde? It might be that the work of Sri Aurobindo may not be easy to absorb like that of the verse of Rumi or even Kabir. Its prodigious philosophical burden might hamper its easy digestion. But then, however, in our pursuit of existence, we need to bring to bear genuine commitment and a deeper sincerity. And certainly a little extra effort would lead us an extra mile in understanding and perhaps an inch closer to truth. Saints and scholars, poets and mystics all have lived their lives intensely. Otherwise, they would not have become what they became. Now, these days, when we boast of information at our fingertips and technology, which has helped to throw the entire world flat on its surface for us to read and browse like an open book, what do we hold within ourselves? Do we really hold within ourselves the desire to know more? We need to take necessarily that extra effort, as I said, earlier. No saint or rishi who has walked the earth in flesh and blood has left without leaving his clear footprints for us to trace. If we have to follow them, we have to follow his footpaths. That doesn't mean that we have to, well, strain ourselves, but we can train ourselves to understand and listen to them and read them with a good ear, with an inner ear. Well, their dreams could catch fire in the process of life's cooking, as to cite Jalaluddin Rumi. Behind Sri Aurobindo's philosophical speculation lies years of systematic exploration of the esoteric dimensions of Vedic poetry and Vedantic thought, and an interior transformation through the methodology of what he developed as Purna Yoga or Integral Yoga. His entire life was a constant pursuit of deeper levels of existence. There are levels of existence beyond the obvious, and saints and scholars, saints and mystics for that matter, Maharshis, who pursue the inner insight, they can sense it and they can follow it. They follow it with a will and a purpose. In his systematic philosophical explication, Sri Aurobindo traces the ascent of consciousness through what Vedantic thought distinguishes as levels of the material, the vital, and the mental. And the ideal for him was a spiritual experience, unifying with the spirit, transforming matter in which spirit is already involved, and divinizing it and changing it. course, these are natural processes, but his yoga, as he will eventually show it, is a process which can actually hasten this. He has developed what he calls a spiritual logic, and there are grades and ranges of consciousness, the subconscious level and the superconscious level, to our everyday waking consciousness. We have to read his life divine. We have to follow him through his synthesizing experience of synthesis of yoga. And in his scheme of things, as he visualizes, almost all our actions in the world are done in the domain of the ignorance. Because in the domain of the ignorance, the separatist ego exists and divides our true selves from the spiritual. This is a point where I and thou would exist. But at a higher level, we have to take him on trust, because we have to listen to what he has to say. We have to read him with a kind of inner sense. Probably this awareness is the reason why the spiritual call took precedence above all else in his life. As I said before, his three-part division of his life, all this, he calls it the adesha, the inner call, the call to spiritual life. From the first section to the second section to the third segment of his life, you can see the trace of this divine call. At the outside, he simply dropped politics and withdrew into the silence of Pondicherry, solitude of Pondicherry. He has mentioned in many of his letters that his life has never been on the surface for men to see, for people to see. It has always been on the inside. The life divine, which is his magnum opus, is a substantial explication of his philosophy of being and becoming, integrating the Yoga Sutras and the Vedic vision. Because of the vastness of its canvas and the complexity of its arguments, the entire book does not yield to any shortening or condensed version. We don't have a key to the life divine. The key to the life divine is to read the life divine itself. We can but take short sorties into it and construct an angle of perception that perhaps would allow us to share his vision of spiritual becoming. Self-knowledge, as he points out, is impossible unless we go behind our surface existence. We have to recognize that there are levels of experience in life, and then we live at the surface, and then behind our surface existence, in the two levels which he talks about, the esoteric and the exoteric, what is seen outside and what goes in the interior levels. In his specialized terminology, there is a divine spark in the human being, in the self of the vital experience, and that is the soul. This is the seat of the essential aesthetic relish. He calls it the seat of the aesthetic relish, and he uses the word the soul. Of course, it's a special term, and this constitutes the aesthetic being in humans, as he points out. This is something which actually makes us receptive to the joy of the variety of existence, in his own words. In resorting to this deeper spiritual being, we can relish the essential joy of existence, the beatitude of becoming. So in many ways, the Aravindian aesthetics is an aesthesis of spiritual being and Godward becoming. The whole process is an aesthetic process of becoming conscious of the spiritual and then transforming oneself into the spiritual. The point that marks him off from several other mystics is his analytical thinking and imaginative writing that ran on parallel rails throughout his life. There is no other mystic or Maharshi of his level and times who has produced such unbelievably, huge, prodigious works, literary, psychological, philosophical, spiritual, the exegesis on the Vedas, the Upanishads, and then translating the scheme of things through what he calls the Prasthanatrayi, the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the Gita, unimaginable, the sort of things which he did, foundations of Indian culture, synthesis of yoga, or the ideal of human unity, the human cycle, and his innumerable poetic works, which I will be discussing shortly, and his magnum opus, which is Life Divine, and Savitri, for that matter. So this is the fact which actually separates him from other mystics and saints. His analytical thinking and imaginative writing. He was a dreamer, no doubt, but as somebody has said, he is a practical dreamer. So he has this levels which he can be analytical, and that is what actually made him, write so much, produce so much, discuss so much, and discuss with many people. He made a religion of poetry, just like some British romantic poets did. There are connections between Sri Aurobindo and romantic poets. There is no doubt about it. But as he is different from them because he was a systematic philosopher and a practicing yogi. This is a very dubious point because many people would say that he was not systematic in his thinking, but he was a philosopher, no doubt, and he has a system which actually evolves through his practice of yoga. From political thought through yoga and mysticism, we can trace his transformation, change. In what follows, what I am going to do, I would be attempting to seek simple parallels between Sri Aurobindo's own short poems, some sonnets perhaps, and what he designates as the transformation of being. Of course, a poet or a philosopher for that matter need not follow a pre-planned course explaining or ratifying his or her systems of belief. And Sri Aurobindo was not a propagandist either. So then one cannot try and harness his poetic voice in a linear order of explication. For as he rightly says, vision is the characteristic power of the poet, and vision does not follow any logic or reason. Nevertheless, let us make some foray into his domain of experience and seek for some sort of correspondence and clarification. Sri Aurobindo's opening thesis, the main tenet of his thinking, is that all problems of existence are essentially problems of harmony. This is how he begins his Life Divine, even. And thus, to seek for harmony with nature and beyond that with the essential spirit is the natural inclination of the thinking self. When there is a rupture or imbalance with Prakriti, it's often the innate spiritual being in the human self that sets the human aspirant on the right course for the pursuit of his or her true being and the resultant transformation. As long as we allow ourselves to be led by the inconscient and the ignorance, these are technical terms which he uses, which if you are familiar with him, will know that inconscient and the ignorant is materially oriented. We will live in the domain of duality, evil, pain and falsehood, if we continue to live in the physical levels. It would follow naturally that there can be no final solution until we have turned our inconscience into the greater consciousness, made the truth of self and spirit our life basis, and transformed our ignorance into higher knowledge. I am quoting from him. A complete and radical transformation of our nature is the only true solution, as he says. And from this false and evil ridden world of dualities, we need to turn to our spiritual selves for the transformation. This is what he says in his Life Divine. Purification of nature by the influence of the spirit is now what I mean by transformation. So he says, purification of nature by the influence of the spirit. So this is the sort of transformation, the interior transformation of matter with the help of the spirit, with the touch of the spirit, which he talks about as transformation. These are technical terms he uses. These are loaded terms. His philosophy, his way of thinking is actually quite dense, and because it requires that sort of density. It's not merely simplifying things. It's not simplistic. And according to him, there is this triple transformation that needs to take place. What is this triple transformation? Let us look at one of his sonnets. See, the main reason why I think his poetry can be a help an aid in understanding his philosophy of triple transformation is because I believe that Sri Aurobindo was essentially a poet. Whatever vocations he went through in life, be it as an early school student or a scholar in Cambridge, or even in a person who was writing political pamphlets and treatises in Hindu Prakash or Bande Madaram, or getting involved in the nationalist movement, moving from place to place, from Calcutta to Baroda, or even, following his leader. Whatever vocations he went through, he was writing poetry. So that way, he believed that poetry was a sort of, an index of his evolving consciousness, and he mentions it very clearly. He is the earliest, in fact, the only person of his times, and perhaps even in our own times, to have actually realized this and conceived of something in a theoretical frame of mind, and called it the poetics of the future, and he called it the future poetry. And he talks about the evolving human race, and poetry as a kind of index which actually unfolds. Now, having said all these things, we should realize that he was essentially a poet, and by understanding his poetry, by following his poems, we can actually get a clearer picture of what he means by this psychic, or the transformation, the interior transformation, the process of being and becoming, the triple transformation. The first step, as we recognize with the help of his philosophy and his poetics towards this self-realization, is to enthrone the soul, the divine psychic individual, in the place of the ego. The ego, of course, for him, it's not a Freudian ego for him, but the ego is the kind of the material substance which gives you the self-consciousness. But this consciousness is there at every stage. According to Sri Aurobindo's division, everything is conscious. Even matter is conscious, the vital life is conscious, and mental state is also conscious. So the consciousness is actually evolving, and it is to be spiritually divinized. So the first process of self-realization is to enthrone the soul, the divine psychic individual, in the place of the ego. Take a look at this sonnet, The Inner Fields. I'll read it. The inner fields. There is a brighter ether than this blue, pretense of an enveloping heavenly vault, a deeper greenness than this laughing assault of emerald rapture pearled with tears of dew. Immortal spaces of cerulean hue are in our reach, and fields without this fault of drab brown earth, and streams that never halt in their deep murmur, which white flowers strew. Floating like stars upon a strip of sky, this world behind is made of truer stuff than the manufactured tissue of earth's grace. There we can walk and see the gods go by, and sip from Hebe's cup nectar enough to make for us heavenly limbs and deathless face. For those who are not aware of poetry and poetics of Sri Aurobindo, this sort of sonnets which he composed for the 10-15 years of his time, when he was in the early times, when he was in Pondicherry. The language which he uses is quite dense, probably because of his classical upbringing. He was so very obsessed with the roots, the semantic roots of each word, because he has this scholar in him, Greek scholar, the Latin scholar, the German scholar, and at the same time, the Sanskrit scholar. So you have the classics which are embedded in his mind. So he uses these words very, very carefully. There is much more than what meets the eye, ear, and touch. This is exactly what the poem says. If you go back once again and read this poem, you will see that there is much more than what this is visible, is sensible, and audible. There is much more than what meets the eye, the ear, and the touch. This is what the poem states. At the very outset, this sonnet reveals the structural transformation after one realizes the profundity of deeper experiences behind the apparent and phenomenal world. Now, this is done through the sestet standing separate from the octet. Of course, this is slightly complex for those who are not schooled in prosody, who are not aware of meter or the structure of sonnets. A sonnet is divided into 8 lines and 6 lines. So this is the sestet, the 6 lines, and the octet is the 8 lines. Normally, as it is given, even in the Shakespearean, the Miltonic, and the Pindar variety, the octet actually poses certain sets of issues, and the sestet concludes it, takes it up, and then complements it. Here, Sri Aurobindo also has strained it. It's not as if as composing a sonnet is a strenuous exercise. Those who have tried writing sonnets will know that. But taking the strain, you have to have your inner vision as well to take up the to lead the reader into the levels of what you want to explore. It's a self-conscious activity, but at the same time it's a kind of inspired activity to find the right word at the right time and place it in the right perspective. In the first stanza, there is a loudness of color and sense, of gravity and touch, while in the second, there is a certain non materiality in terms of a floating in space not governed by the gravity of earth or phenomena. This sense experience of a sensual noumena is what the poem is generally about. This is where we take our first preliminary step to self realization. This is the sense of the spiritual at the heart of things. Of course, there is no substantial conclusion to the poem. The poet appears to leave us all of a sudden with a gentle nudge towards the world behind. He uses the word the world behind. What we had so far held as real. The world behind is what we have held up as real. Perhaps on account of its structure, the poem is intended to effect just that, floating like stars upon a strip of sky. Anyway, there is the inception of a new sense in terms of a poetics of perception that the reader is invited to share. From here to the larger engaging vision of a multitude of words, the distance is not too far. Now I'll take up the another poem which is called The Other Earths. The Other Earths. One second. If you have this, the complete poems of Sri Aurobindo, collected poems, it comes in the 133, page 133, The Other Earths. The other earths, an irised multitude of hills and seas, and glint of brooks in the green wilderness, and trackless stars, and miracled symphonies of hues that float in ethers shadowless, a dance of fireflies in the fretted gloom, in a pale midnight, the moon's silver flare, fire importunities of scarlet bloom, and bright suddenness of wings in a golden air. Strange bird and animal forms like memories cast on the rapt silence of earthly woods, calm faces of the gods on backgrounds vast, bringing the marvel of the infinitudes. Through glimmering wheels of wonder and delight, world after world bursts on the awakened sight. Of course, at one reading, this poem will not make much sense. You have to read many times. And what I am trying to do is, I am trying to connect this poem with what had happened earlier. As I said at the beginning itself, a poet need not be logical or making a structured movement from one point to the next. Insights come here and there. One poem, if it is written in 1910, may complement another one in 1920, and another one written in 1913 will actually complement one which happens in the 1930s. So it doesn't really matter whether it is, there is a linear structure, but the connections have to be, we have to read with the inner ear, as Sri Aurobindo himself has pointed out. We have to, train our inner ear to see the kind of connections. So this other earths is what I think is something which at a preliminary reading, one can note the tonal difference between the two sonnets, what was said earlier and the second sonnet. While the previous one appears to state some experience that is there and can be had, there is a certain experience which could be within our reach. There is an experience which could be had. The second one bursts directly onto the experience per se. The earlier one actually tells you that there is an experience which you can go if you go deeper in, and you can see that behind something. But here he does not give you that kind of a time frame. Here it is just a burst directly onto the experience per se as such. The subject who undergoes this experience does not even appear until the last line, and that too almost as a sort of afterthought. World after world bursts onto the awakened sight. Who is the person who is dreaming? Who is the person who is experiencing? That is only kept for a later thought. Almost like you need to make a logical connection to the person who experiences. Now, the mind that experiences in poetry is sometimes similar or different. It can be either similar or different to the mind that experiences in a spiritual frame of reference. Poetry is always a sort of afterthought. You never know when you are going through this experience, you may not be scribbling this down. It could be perhaps at a little later, or maybe you write this poem earlier to your experience. That could happen. So it has to fall into place. That is about all. There is no ego here, only the expansion of vision and insight. This whole poem is about the expanding vision and insight, the bursting on the awakened sight. Now, some scholars would insist on a sort of linear analysis of Sri Aurobindo's works, as I just mentioned, whereby one unfolds his conceptual and aesthetic framework in a systematic and chronological manner. There are several scholars who have worked on this sort of poems, finding the actual date of its composition and say whether it corresponds with the next day's insight. That need not be. Such an analysis, I believe, would perhaps follow the time scale of these poetic compositions, when it was composed, the spiritual levels he had achieved at that specific time, and the corresponding corroborations evinced by his philosophical and explicatory epistles, letters written to the various disciples, etc. Sri Aurobindo and K.D. Setna, of course, many of his disciples, they were in correspondence, because whenever he wrote a poem, Setna or many Anirudh Bharan or somebody would raise a question and he answered them, and they themselves would come and show him the pieces which they composed, and Sri Aurobindo would actually talk about the levels of experience in those poems. But if you go through that, if you look at his letters on yoga, letters on poetry, letters through all his correspondence, if you find this sort of thing, it may not dovetail with this sort of experience which I am trying to talk about. This exercise, no doubt, would yield suitable results. But my own methodology would be to contextualize the poetic pieces primarily in terms of their poetic visions that they afford, irrespective of whether they are juvenilia or verses composed at a later stage in the yogi's life. Now, what I am looking at is a poetic evidence that would dovetail with spiritual experience. It would do well if one were to keep in mind the idea that poetic experience in themselves do not follow any time scale or logical structure. They occur at random, and in the case of a yogi poet like Sri Aurobindo, sometimes visions could be etched in a poetic mold much before or after they surface to the logical mind. The two sonnets arranged side by side appear to complete a totality of vision and insight. This is my argument. One speaks of the possibilities and the other carries it forward. The reader is invited to share. The reader is not marginalized. It's an open text, and the reader is invited to share. What is significant for us here is that Sri Aurobindo's works function as open texts, allowing for the willing reader to explore and make connections wherever possible, be it philosophy or poetry or his poetic explications or his textual logic or whatever he is writing. They cannot be dismissed as mere pieces of a large jigsaw puzzle. They are attempts to gather together bits and pieces of the inner experience of the touch of the spirit and the awakening of the soul. There are certainly other instances in the poems where this specific experience of the opening up of the aesthetic being is evident, no doubt. At almost no point in his spiritual evolution has Sri Aurobindo the poet ceased to explore correspondence through poetic utterance. That is why I keep on saying that Sri Aurobindo is essentially a poet, because at every point in his life he tried to explore through poetry and his philosophy and his logical sort of argument what it means to be alive and what this transformation through the being and becoming in this tripartite triple transformation of the material, the vital, and the mental, the levels will how he undergoes that. Now, having said that, the next step in the spiritual becoming is to become aware of the eternal self in us, unborn and one with the self of all beings. One has to become, because this is what he says in his Life Divine. What is this triple transformation? What is the third step? That is the step one has to realize that there is an eternal self in us which is unborn yet, and which is one with the self of all beings. This self-realization liberates and at the same time universalizes. There is a liberation and a universalization at the same time. Now, we will read in the following sonnet, "The soul of all that lives, calm, pure, alone, revealed its boundless self, mystic and bare." So we can see that there is this transformation of vision. The soul of all beings lives calm and pure and alone. Despite its essential passive nature, the soul is able to reveal itself in its boundless, mystic and bare aloneness. Because the essential spiritual self in the spiritual self that can actually relish existence is what he calls the soul. In his technical term, it is the soul. And the soul is able to reveal itself in its boundless mystical loneliness. The sensing self, on the other hand, assumes a passive role, receiving the enlargement of vision. This is the sonnet which I would like to read now. It's called The Hilltop Temple. Okay, here. It's on page 164. It's called the Hilltop Temple. This is something which I believe there is a kind of inner sensing. After unnumbered steps of a hill stair, I saw upon the earth's head, brilliant with sun, the immobile goddess in her house of stone, in a loneliness of meditating air. Wise were the human hands that set her there, above the world and time's dominion. The soul of all that lives, calm, pure, alone, revealed its boundless self, mystic and bare. So I just quoted these lines. Our body is an epitome of some vast that masks its presence by our humanness. In us, the secret spirits can indite a page and summary of the infinite, a nodus of eternity expressed live in an image and a sculptured face. This poem reads like a modernist poem because of the terseness and the compactness of all that is. And another thing that as a practicing poet, I am always, surprised at the simplicity with which this poet has handled it. This doesn't look as if it is strained or deliberate. It just comes naturally. There is a spontaneity, but at the same time, the structure is very effortlessly carried out. One second. Now, the next sonnet that follows, however, does not unfold any unified receiving I and self. The narrative here revolves around the duality of myself and thyself, I and thou, the divine sight. It's immediately in the same on page 165. Next to that, the hilltop temple. These are perhaps the early sonnets, but the divine sight, the inner eye, is very clearly visible here. This talks about the sight again. The hilltop temple talks about the inner sense, and the divine sight would talk about the inner sight as such. See, our five senses, sense of touch, sense of smell, sense of the vision, and the audible, and the touch, all those things are beautifully carried out in these sonnets. So here we see the divine sight. Each sight is now immortal with thy bliss. My soul, perhaps this is the first place where you encounter the word my in my sort of reading. My soul, through the rapt eyes, has come to see. A veil is rent, and they no more can miss the miracle of thy world epiphany. Into an ecstasy of vision, caught each natural object is of thee a part, a rapture symbol. From thy substance wrought, a poem shaped in beauty's living heart, a master work of color and design, a mighty sweetness borne on grandiose wings, a burdened wonder of significant line reveals itself in even commonest things. All forms are thy dream, dialect of delight, O absolute, O vivid, infinite. The key lines of this piece are a burdened wonder of insignificant line, a burdened wonder of insignificant line, last but third line. A burdened wonder of insignificant line reveals itself in even commonest things. With the touch of the divine soul, even the ordinary things appear uncommon in burdened wonder. The word burden here is to be interpreted creatively as the self's quality in still being able to establish a connection to the earth, to mortality, to the transience of human experience. There is the gravity of reality, the material status of the earth, and yet they appear in sweetness and delight. The ananda of existence, felt in the veins and gathered in the soul, Satchit Ananda. The gradual increase of awareness is modified in the octet and sestet, while in the first 8 lines we encounter a spate of evanescent imagery like the miracle of thy world epiphany, in an ecstasy of vision caught. Each natural object is of thee a part, a rapture symbol from thy substance wrote, a poem shaped in beauty's living heart. This is quite evanescent imagery, very, very transient sort of imagery. The sestet, on the other hand, the 6 lines, on the other hand, makes a clear break with its burdened wonder of significant line, revealing itself in even commonest things. Words like masterwork, mighty sweetness, burdened wonder are such almost ordinary ones that could evoke everyday feelings, but infused with some extraordinary energy, because all forms are thy dream dialect of delight, O absolute, O infinite. Life has multiple levels of being and having, knowing and becoming, the planes and parts of being. Once the transcendental is felt within and the soul realizes the deep calm, even the ordinary is infused with the extraordinary. The miracles of existence, the true truth of things, holds within itself. Now, the third step is to know the divine being who is at once our supreme transcendental self, the cosmic being, the foundation of our universality. This is what he says in his Life Divine. In a poem entitled The Witness and the Wheel, Sri Aurobindo has written, I quote unquote, Witness, who then art thou? One with thee, who am I? Nameless, watching the wheel whirl across time and space? Unquote. There is a divinity that sits in the center of all existence and watches, witnessing all action. This is our transcendent self, our cosmic self. Sri Aurobindo, of course, was a Vedic scholar and an Upanishadic scholar. He is so well versed with what he calls the Prasthanatrayi, the three texts, Upanishads and the Gita and the Veda. In the Mundaka Upanishad, we have this image of the two birds. The companions who are always seated cling to the same tree. Of these two, everyone knows that one eats this fruit and the other looks on without eating. This is the two birds, which the image is fairly discussed in philosophy. This could be interpreted as the kind of body and soul nexus, the union of the body and the soul. The body relishes in the samsara, the world of sensations, and the soul looks on as a witness. So this is the witness and the experience, the experiencer, and the person who looks at the experience or senses the experience, the karma sakshi. In our context, this is the witness and the wheel. The calmness and composure of the bird signifies that calm of mind, all passion spent. We can quote Shakespeare in Hamlet, there is a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. These two birds, companions who are always united, cling to the self same tree. One eats the sweet fruit and the other looks on without eating. This is something which we have already seen in this poem. Now, when we err or make mistakes and commit mistakes, the touch of the divine rectifies our actions. But what is required is our preparedness. One should be prepared. Even if God were to come, the Spirit were to descend, it requires a kind of receptivity. Acceptance is very, very important. So this brings us to the most complex poem that Sri Aurobindo has written. The short poem, of course, I am limiting myself to the short poems. Not that, in my next lecture I shall deal at length on the vision in Savitri, the long poem. But here, I'll just look at the short poem. Transformation. Often discussed, and a lot of people many scholars have written dissertations on it, philosophers, political scientists, social scientists, and literature scholars, they have written their PhD dissertations on Sri Aurobindo, and they have discussed this poem at length. So this is transformation, since it is so very familiar to most of you, but still maybe you have even studied it in school or college. I'll just read it quickly. Transformation. My breath runs in a subtle rhythmic stream. It fills my members with a might divine. I have drunk the infinite like a giant's wine. Time is my drama or my pageant dream. Now are my illumined cells joy's flaming scheme, and changed my thrilled and branching nerves to fine channels of rupture, opal and hyaline, for the influx of the unknown and the supreme. I am no more a vassal of flesh, a slave to nature and her leaden rule. I am caught no more in the senses' narrow mesh. My soul, unhorizoned, widens to measureless sight. My body is God's happy living tool. My spirit is a vast sun of deathless light. It's a very complex sonnet, but at the same time, this talks about the transformed stage of existence of the self and the body in a temporal mold as well, not merely in the spiritual level. Life breath still pulses through the veins composed of flesh and blood. Lifeblood is still there, life breath is still there, the vitality is still there, and time is my drama or my pageant dream, as he says. As the context of this sonnet has been widely discussed with many levels, there is little point in overstating its vision. I don't want to strain myself to overstate the vision. The idea that this poem tries to convey is caught in the last three lines very succinctly. My soul unhorizoned widens to measureless sight. My body is God's happy living tool. My spirit a vast sun of deathless light. Now, soul, body, and spirit are infused with a spiritual transformation. The poet is able to experience this, and through the evocations that are given in the poem, if you are sensitive enough, you can feel the spiritual transformation. Poetry is the index of the evolving consciousness. And these sonnets, if they are kept in the order in which I am trying to argue, they tell us about levels of Sri Aurobindo's experience in his process of spiritual transformation. What is interesting is that while the transformed status of both the soul and the spirit are described in terms of the negative, you can see that there are negative terms which is used in that unhorizoned, deathless. While referring to the body has attained the transformed status of being God's happy living tool. This feeling of oceanic oneness with the divine is a poetic feeling of being on fire. The Tamil poet, Subramanya Bharati, sang in a very short poem, "When I put my finger into the fire, O Nandalala, I feel the exaltation of your touch." Rumi says, we should remember, I used to be raw, then I was cooked, now on fire. So there is this transformation, there is shedding of the negative and the moving into the positive realms in a kind of inclusive transformation. There is no division, there is no divide, but there is an inclusive, not an overhang, but an inclusive, positive change, transformation. In the domain of our ignorance, where we live our everyday lives, the touch of the divine is easily overlooked. I don't want to go into the philosophical level of Sri Aurobindo. Of course, in a little while, if time permits, I can go into the discussions through his own technical terms. But then one could over stress it, one could go beyond it, one could over interpret it, and then that will put off the reader or the sensitive listener. I don't want to do that. I would like to find the connections. My idea is to give a kind of perspective to the sensitive mind, the person who genuinely, the sincere mind which genuinely wants to understand this mystic, to understand this Maharshi, this Rishi who lived among us and who has left a huge, prodigious 30 volumes of writing. Sri Aurobindo library comprises of 30 volumes, and still people are working on his works. So we might even find new connections, new letters that Sri Aurobindo has written, which could add to his corpus of his work. But without stressing that, one should realize that, as I mentioned earlier, the soul or the aesthetic being in the human beings constantly reminds us of our divine origin, and in the process of God-word becoming. In a poem which he wrote, which is called different poem in different meters, Dreamboat. This is also part of many anthologies. This is often discussed, and several scholars have also interpreted this poem in several ways. But he states this in this poem very clearly, how this God word becoming, how we generally tend to overlook this, but we have to touch our soul, or the soul itself will actually constantly remind us of this divine dreamboat, and listen to the dreamboat. Who was it, he says in the dreamboat, who was it that came to me in a boat made of dream fire? Who was it that came to me in a boat made of dream fire? With his flame brow and his sun gold body, melted was the silence into a sweet secret murmur. Do you come now? Is the heart's fire ready? Now, I want you to be sensitive. Anybody who likes to read this systematically, I want you to be sensitive about the visual images, the auditory images, and the tactile images which Sri Aurobindo has used in this. Even the taste images, the sweet secret murmur. So he has actually, it's a kind of hyper aesthetics, where all the senses are brought together. The meta aesthetic, the hyper aesthetic, and the kind of, inclusiveness of all human experience is brought here. Melted was the silence into a sweet secret murmur. Sweet secret murmur. Do you come now? Is the heart's fire ready? One has to read it slowly. Hidden in the recesses of the heart, something shuddered. It recalled all that the life's joy cherished, imaged the felicity it must leave lost forever. And the boat passed, and the gold god vanished. Now within the hollowness of the world's breast inhabits. For the love died and the old joy ended, void of a felicity that has fled, gone forever, and the gold god and the dream boat come not. It's a very tragic sort of poem where the mind, if it is not prepared, it might overlook this call to the divine, which is already innate in the material, in the vital, and in the mental state of human beings who are in the process of evolving. The psychic opening and aspiration are not easily come by. The mother of the Aurobindo ashram also has mentioned this, that it is important for us to be ready, because it's not easy for us to have the psychic opening and the aspiration to be, they are not easily, anyone can't just take it like that. You have to prepare yourself. The touch of the divine passes us by in all our mundanity, because we simply love being in the grip of ignorance, cherishing its imaged felicity. We assume that being in the present, we are all very happy, in the felicitous condition of our material existence. In the case of Sri Aurobindo, the transformation is achieved through a consistent pursuit of the divine through the triple levels, as I mentioned: body, life, and mind. This is the triple transformation. His life is a life of yoga. All life is yoga, he says. But as he himself has noted, all life is yoga in his life divine. I'll quote from the Life Divine, a very dense passage, but I will read. This is Life Divine, page 631 to 32. Page 631 to 32. Yes. The origin of falsehood and evil. This is where he talks about cosmic being and the divine being, how the liberation of the will leads to the divine existence. Let me read this. This is slightly complex, but please pay attention to what I am reading. Quote unquote: the liberation of the will follows upon the liberation in knowledge and is its dynamic consequence. It is knowledge that purifies. It is truth that liberates. Evil is the fruit of a spiritual ignorance, and it will disappear only by the growth of a spiritual consciousness and the light of spiritual knowledge. The division of our being from the being of others can only be healed by removing the divorce of nature from the inner soul reality, by abolishing the veil between our becoming and our self being, by bridging the remoteness of our individuality in nature from the divine being, who is the omnipresent reality in nature and above nature at the same time. But the last division to be removed is the scission between this nature and the superstructure, which is the self power of the divine existence. 631 to 32. Unquote. It may not be difficult even for a general reader to recognize how the intellect images the experience in a philosophical mode and how the similar experience is explored in a poetic mode. Now, Sri Aurobindo has thought systematically, because every time he was sending off this to be printed in Arya, he was sending one section. He was philosophically thinking, intellectually thinking, but in poetic mode he was experiencing in a different way. Perhaps Sri Aurobindo himself would have felt an immediacy and a natural affinity towards the poetic, because he was essentially a poet, as I keep on stressing, because in the poetic world all binaries are resolved and evened out. The experience of the integral yoga manifests itself effortlessly through the rhythmic tongue of poetry. The key concepts in the context, of course, are being and becoming. I underline this word being and becoming, experiencing existence self-consciously and then becoming in the process of a spiritual transformation. In poetic terms, there is an inner transformation that occurs when the touch of the divine is internalized and realized. This is the process of internal becoming, a definite state change, total transformation change. State change is there. But in spiritual terms, this is the touch of the essential being, tracing a being calm of mind, all passion spent. In our ceaseless exploration of reality, we trace the arc of inward and Godward becoming, and once the ascent and descent are integrated, what is left is the abiding spirit. It is not I or thou. This ascending, descending, and integration. This is the three-part transformation. So again, a tripartite division, not a divide but an integration. Ascending, the desire ascends and the grace descends, and then there is the spiritual integration. And what is left is the kind of abiding spirit in the Leela of transformation. There is no existence of I or thou. There is no divide. There is no cogito. There is no cogito which actually says I exist and I am real. There is no real and unreal. There is no I and thou divide. There is a unity, a spiritual calmness of all passion spent. This is the poetic culmination of the triple transformation that Sri Aurobindo desires. And I think in my lecture, what I have tried to show is that there is this poetic transformation which the poet experiences and which he is couched, which he has tried to frame through his, I used only his short poems in his magnum opus in Savitri, which will become the next lecture. I shall try to explore it at a greater length and see how this spiritual transformation is effected. But whatever it is, philosophically, he has tried to reason it out through his philosophical works. In Synthesis of Yoga, he tried the praxis, and in The Life Divine, he tried the thesis, the concepts, and he tried to experience it poetically through his poems. And that is what brings me to the close of this lecture in this three-part transformation, Sri Aurobindo's poetry and triple transformation of being. Thank you.